I'm standing here at the John Frost Bridge in Arnhem, Netherlands. Today, this vital crossing over the Lower Rhine is a peaceful scene. Cars glide effortlessly across its span, pedestrians stroll along its banks, and the river flows quietly beneath. It's an ordinary day in a vibrant, modern city, utterly devoid of the terror and desperation that once consumed this very spot. But 79 years ago, this bridge was hell on earth. It was the linchpin of Operation Market Garden, a bold Allied gamble meant to end the war by Christmas. For 9 agonizing days in September 1944, their courage, their sacrifice, their unwavering resolve, it echoes through these quiet waters still. And today, I'm going to tell you exactly what happened here.
Imagine this: thousands of men falling from the sky. Not one or two, but a whole army. Parachutes blooming like giant white flowers across the autumn fields of Holland. It was September 1944. The war in Europe had been going on for 5 long years. Everyone was tired. Everyone wanted it to end. And then came a plan. A huge, bold, daring plan. The biggest airborne operation in the history of warfare. Its goal? To end the war by Christmas. Just imagine that hope. Let me tell you about a small Dutch town. It was called Arnhem. For 4 long years, the people there had lived under German occupation. Every single day was a struggle. Food was scarce. Freedom was nothing more than a dream. But they never gave up hope. They listened to secret radios hidden under floorboards. They whispered stories of the Allies coming. Can you imagine that feeling? Waking up every single morning, not knowing if today would be the day. One crisp September morning, a young mother in Arnhem was making breakfast for her children. An old man was riding his bicycle to work. And then they heard it. A distant rumble, growing louder and louder and louder. They looked up at the sky, and what they saw would change their lives forever.
The operation had a name: Operation Market Garden, and it was really 2 plans fused together. Market was the airborne part. Over 35,000 paratroopers would drop behind enemy lines. Their mission? To capture a series of critical bridges stretching across the Netherlands. Garden was the ground assault. A powerful armored force called XXX Corps would race north up a single road, 60 miles, straight through enemy territory, linking up with the paratroopers, crossing those captured bridges, and then driving straight into the heart of Germany. It sounded brilliant. A surgical strike, a way to end the war quickly. But here's what they didn't say out loud. It was also incredibly, dangerously risky. Imagine trying to thread a needle while someone is shooting at your hands. Just one road, narrow, flat, surrounded on both sides by soft, wet fields, where tanks would sink instantly. If anything went wrong on that road, anything at all, the entire plan would collapse.
If you want to discover more truths about military history, subscribe to our channel right now. Don't forget to like this video
It helps us a lot to produce more high-quality documentaries. And please, leave a comment below sharing your opinions or a story about veterans in your family. Thanks for watching.
And then there was the intelligence, the information about the enemy. It wasn't quite right. Dutch resistance fighters, brave men and women risking their lives every single day, tried to warn the Allied commanders. They said, "There are German tanks near Arnhem, SS Panzer divisions, heavy armor." But the Allies didn't believe them. Or perhaps they simply didn't want to believe them. They had this big, exciting, history-making plan, and a few German tanks were not going to stop it. If only they had listened. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the brilliant, deeply confident British commander behind the plan, was certain it would work. On September 10th, 1944, the order was given. Operation Market Garden was a go. The fate of thousands of men, the hope of millions, rested on this one extraordinary gamble.
The British 1st Airborne Division had the hardest task of all. Their target was Arnhem, the farthest bridge, the most important bridge, the one that crossed the mighty Rhine River itself. But something went terribly wrong from the very first moment. The paratroopers landed miles from the bridge. Miles! Through the trees, through the fields. They began to march, and almost immediately, they ran straight into the enemy. Not just any enemy. 2 SS Panzer divisions, elite German armored units. Right there, right where they had landed. The intelligence failure was catastrophic. Most of the British paratroopers were stopped cold. But one man refused to stop. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost. He led his battalion through the back streets of Arnhem, moving quietly, moving fast. And against all odds, he reached the north end of the bridge. His men dug in. They barricaded the buildings. They prepared to fight. And fight they did. For 4 days and 4 nights, Frost and his men held that bridge. Against tanks, against artillery, against wave after wave of German infantry. With almost no food, almost no water, almost no ammunition. Just courage and a refusal to give up. We are just scratching the surface of this incredible history. If you are enjoying this documentary, take a brief moment right now to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Your support is what allows us to keep digging into these forgotten archives. Back down the road, the battle for the Nijmegen Bridge was reaching its desperate climax. The Americans of the 82nd Airborne knew that Frost's men were dying in Arnhem. They knew every hour mattered. And so they did something almost unthinkable. They crossed the Wall River in small canvas boats, in broad daylight, under withering fire from the far bank. Men were hit before they even reached the water. Boats capsized. The river ran red. But they kept paddling, and they reached the other side. They took the bridge. It was one of the most heroic river crossings of the entire Second World War. But by the time the bridge was secure, precious days had been lost. 30th Corps was still fighting its way north, still agonizingly slowly. Arnhem was still miles away, and time was running out. By the 4th day, Colonel Frost had been wounded. His men were exhausted. Their ammunition was nearly gone.
The buildings they defended were on fire. There was nothing left to fight with. The survivors were taken prisoner. The Arnhem Bridge was lost. 30 Corps pushed forward desperately. They could see the smoke rising over Arnhem. They could almost hear the guns. But they could not break through. The Germans held firm. After 9 days of brutal fighting, the order finally came. Withdraw. Under the cover of darkness, in pouring rain, the remaining British paratroopers were ferried back across the Rhine, quietly, in small boats, leaving behind their dead. Of nearly 10,000 men who entered the Arnhem perimeter, fewer than 2,000 made it out. Let that number sink in. 10,000 men went in. 2,000 came out.
Operation Market Garden had failed. The bridge at Arnhem was a bridge too far. The war did not end by Christmas. It would drag on for 8 more months. Thousands more would die. But let us not end there, because the men of Market Garden deserve better than that. They jumped into occupied territory with almost no support against an enemy far stronger than anyone admitted. They fought with a ferocity that stunned even the Germans who defeated them. General Wilhelm Dietrich, the SS commander who fought them at Arnhem, said afterwards, "In all my years of war, I never saw men fight like this." That is what we must remember. Not just the failure of the plan, but the extraordinary courage of the men. The young men who stood in open doorways, above clouds, and jumped anyway. The men who crossed rivers under fire, in little canvas boats. The men who held a bridge for 4 days, against everything, with nothing. They did not fail. The plan failed them. And the people of Arnhem, they never forgot. Every year, the Dutch people still come to the graves of the British paratroopers. They place flowers. They bow their heads. They say thank you to men they never met, who died trying to set them free. That is the true legacy of Operation Market Garden. Not a bridge lost, but a debt that can never be repaid. We will remember them. Always.
Thank you so much for traveling back in time with us today. If this story moved you, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and click the notification bell so you never miss our next historic journey. Before you go, leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your interaction keeps this history alive. Until next time, this is Dr. Vance, signing off.